This is where millions of Americans just lost leverage they didn't even know they had. I'm watching Trump slap a 10% tariff on Canadian energy, thinking he's squeezing Canada for cash. And what actually happens? Quebec's premier walks up to a microphone and says he's exploring breaking contracts with Massachusetts and New York, contracts worth billions. Infrastructure Americans spent years building, gone just like that. Let me show you what I mean. Massachusetts just finished a transmission line. 10 years of construction took them through legal battles, environmental fights, and public referendums. The New England Clean Energy Connect literally went live this month, January 2026. 145 miles of high-voltage cable bringing Canadian hydropower straight to Massachusetts. The state celebrates. The governor gives speeches about clean energy and lower bills. They're planning to get 20% of their electricity through this thing. Then Trump imposes tariffs and Quebec stops selling power to the spot market. 2 days after the tariffs hit, the transmission line goes silent for over a week. Now, Hydro-Quebec says it was weather. Warmer temperatures made spot sales unprofitable. But here's what nobody's talking about. Premier Legault wasn't subtle. He went on television and said Quebec is looking at breaking the contracts, not threatening, exploring legal options. Think about what that means. Massachusetts spent a decade building infrastructure specifically designed to import more Canadian electricity. They signed 20-year contracts. They promised ratepayers $50 million in annual savings. Then Trump starts a trade war with the supplier. And this isn't just Massachusetts. New York has the same problem. Worse, actually. They're finishing the Champlain-Hudson Power Express right now. 339 miles of underwater cable from Quebec to Queens. $6 billion expected to power 1 million homes in New York City starting in May. A 20-year contract with fixed pricing. The whole climate strategy depends on it. Trump's tariffs put all of that at risk.
But here's where it gets complicated. This isn't about whether Quebec will actually cut the power. It's about what Trump just revealed. He showed everyone that New England is structurally dependent on Canadian electricity, and Quebec has options Americans don't have. Let me explain why this is so catastrophically stupid. For 40 years, New England has been buying power from Quebec. It started in the 1980s. They built a 932-mile transmission line from James Bay to Boston specifically to bring Canadian hydro south. The relationship worked because both sides won. Quebec had massive surplus capacity from dams in northern Quebec. New England had expensive fossil fuel generation and climate goals they couldn't meet domestically.
Vermont gets 25% of its electricity from a single contract with Hydro-Quebec. 25%? That contract runs through 2038. It's been keeping Vermont's rates stable while other New England states saw 20 to 40% price spikes. One contract, one supplier. 40% of Vermont electric co-op power comes from Canadian imports. New York imported 7.7 terawatt hours from Quebec and Ontario last year. That's not backup power. That's structural dependency. And Trump walked right into it. He saw Canadian energy and figured he'd charge 10% extra. He didn't consult anyone who understands how electricity actually works. He didn't think about the transmission infrastructure. He didn't consider that electricity isn't like oil. You can't put it on a tanker and ship it to Asia. Electricity flows through wires between directly connected grids. Quebec has the dams. Quebec has the reservoirs. Quebec can hold water or release it based on when prices are best. New England has natural gas plants, some nuclear, growing renewables, and a desperate need for more clean power than it can generate itself. The dependency runs one direction, and Trump just reminded everyone which direction that is. Wait, it gets worse. Most people don't think about where their electricity comes from. You flip a switch, the lights work, the grid is invisible. But in New England, that invisible infrastructure is heavily Canadian. And what Trump did was make it visible in the worst possible way. Let's talk numbers, real numbers. In 2024, Canada exported about 30 terawatt hours to the United States. Total value, $2.7 billion Canadian. Not huge for Canada's economy, but critically important for specific regions in the US. New York alone imported 7.7 terawatt hours. New England gets roughly 5% of its total electricity from Canada in normal years. But during peak demand, winter cold snaps, summer heat waves, that percentage jumps much higher because Canadian hydropower is cheaper and more reliable than running natural gas plants when spot market prices spike. Here's what changes the whole picture. New England's grid runs on natural gas. Over 60% of generation comes from gas-fired plants. When demand surges, natural gas prices explode because the same pipelines supply heating fuel and power plants. Wholesale electricity costs can jump to multiples of normal rates. Canadian hydropower dampens those spikes. When New England prices surge, Quebec sells more electricity south, bringing prices back down. Consumers don't see the massive rate increases they would experience without imports. Without Canadian power, New England faces two options: build more natural gas generation, expensive and contradicting every climate goal, or build massive battery storage to back up renewables, which is even more expensive and nowhere near commercially viable at the required scale. So Massachusetts and New York chose a third option: import clean Canadian hydro through dedicated transmission lines with fixed pricing. Billions spent on infrastructure that only works if Quebec actually sends the electricity. Now, what I'm about to tell you kept me up last night. These aren't spot market purchases. The New England Clean Energy Connect has a 20-year contract for 1,090 megawatts. That's 9.55 terawatt hours annually, all from Hydro-Quebec. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express is another 20-year contract, 1,250 megawatts, enough to supply 20% of New York City's electricity needs. Combined, we're talking about infrastructure investment exceeding $10 billion. Money already spent, cables already laid, converter stations already built, all designed specifically to make Massachusetts and New York more dependent on Quebec hydro than they already were. Governor Healey in Massachusetts was celebrating 2 weeks ago. The Clean Energy Connect was finally operational after years of legal fights in Maine. She called it affordable, stable power that would help Massachusetts meet climate goals. Then Trump imposed tariffs and Hydro-Quebec stopped selling to the spot market. Premier Legault said Quebec is exploring breaking the new contracts if tariffs aren't resolved. But that's not even the real story. The real story is time. You can't build power plants or transmission lines quickly. The Clean Energy Connect took 10 years from conception to operation. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express has been in development for 15 years. If Quebec reduced exports significantly, New England couldn't replace that capacity for years. The region would face higher electricity costs, reliability concerns during peak demand, and complete failure to meet climate commitments. States would need to delay retirements of fossil fuel plants, run aging infrastructure longer, and accept that renewable targets were unachievable. The political consequences would be immediate. Voters, already angry about energy costs, would see prices rise further. Climate advocates would watch emissions increase. Businesses with clean energy commitments would question whether these states could deliver on promises that attracted their investments. And the leverage wouldn't disappear. Even if Trump backed down tomorrow, the precedent is set. Quebec now knows it can threaten American energy security. Future negotiations over trade, environmental policy, water rights, anything crossing the border will happen with both sides aware that Quebec controls electricity supplies northeastern states desperately need. Here's what nobody's talking about. Quebec doesn't need American markets the way Alberta needs them for oil. Electricity doesn't work like oil. Quebec can sell power to Ontario. They can hold water in reservoirs. They can wait for better prices. The flexibility is asymmetric. Premier Legault was careful to distinguish between Trump and ordinary Americans. He said repeatedly his issues were with Washington, not with Massachusetts or New York residents. But he also made crystal clear that Quebec would protect its own interests. This is the part that changes everything. Trump thought Canadian energy dependence was one-directional. The United States imports oil and natural gas from Canada. Therefore, Canada needs American markets. That's true for oil. It's absolutely wrong for electricity. And what just happened proves it.
When Trump announced tariffs in early February 2025, Hydro-Quebec immediately stopped exporting to New England's wholesale spot market.
The main transmission line went silent. For over a week, no power flowed south. They claimed it was weather-related. Warmer temperatures made sales less profitable, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Exports stopped 2 days after tariffs took effect. Then Premier Legault got specific. He didn't threaten to cut Vermont's existing contract from 1987. Vermont didn't deserve punishment. But the new contracts with Massachusetts and New York hadn't started yet. Breaking them would be legally complicated, but potentially possible if Quebec argued tariffs fundamentally altered the economic terms. And even if Quebec couldn't legally break contracts, they could make life difficult. The fixed contracts specify minimum deliveries, not maximum. Quebec could meet bare contractual requirements while refusing to sell any additional power on the spot market. That matters enormously during peak demand, when New England relies on imports to avoid blackouts. The Hydro-Quebec CEO was blunt. He called the Trump administration a bully and said Quebec would meet tariffs rate for rate. If Washington wanted to charge 10% on energy imports, Quebec could add surcharges to electricity exports. The contracts might prevent outright cancellation, but pricing was negotiable within parameters. The message was unmistakable. Trump thought he was imposing costs on Canada. What he actually did was give Quebec leverage over northeastern states that depend on Canadian electricity for grid stability and climate goals. Now here's where this gets really bad. Ontario Premier Doug Ford tried the same play Trump did. In March 2025, Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York as retaliation for tariffs. Trump immediately threatened to double tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50% and said he'd declare a national electricity emergency. Ford backed down within 24 hours and suspended the surcharge. But Quebec didn't back down. Legault kept the pressure on, kept talking about breaking contracts, kept reminding everyone that Quebec has options. Why the difference? Ontario sells surplus power to balance its grid. Ontario needs those sales. When Ford threatened to weaponize electricity, he was bluffing with a weak hand. Quebec isn't bluffing. Quebec has long-term contracts, fixed pricing, and dedicated transmission infrastructure that Americans built specifically to import Quebec power. The leverage is real. And here's what I think Trump missed entirely. The economic impact on Quebec if they reduced exports isn't catastrophic. Hydro-Quebec earned $3 billion from U.S. exports in 2023, meaningful income for the provincial government, but Quebec's economy doesn't depend on it. If Quebec reduced electricity exports to New England by 30%, that's roughly 800 megawatts of lost capacity. New England would need to replace that with more expensive natural gas generation during peak periods. Wholesale electricity costs would rise. Ratepayers would see higher bills. Climate emissions would increase as fossil fuel plants ran more frequently. Quebec would lose export revenue, but could sell power to Ontario or hold it in reservoirs. The flexibility is asymmetric. New England needs Quebec more than Quebec needs New England. What makes Quebec's position even stronger is what Americans built. Massachusetts spent a decade and massive political capital getting the Clean Energy Connect approved. They fought environmental groups. They fought fossil fuel companies that didn't want competition. They fought Maine residents who didn't want transmission lines through pristine forest. They won all those battles, built the infrastructure, signed the contracts, and then Trump started a trade war with their supplier. New York's situation is identical. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express is finishing construction right now, expected to be operational in May 2026. $6 billion buried underwater through Lake Champlain and the Hudson River to avoid environmental opposition. A 20-year contract with fixed pricing. Governor Hochul has been promoting this as critical infrastructure for New York's climate goals. The state needs to hit 70% renewable electricity by 2030. Without Canadian hydro, that target becomes nearly impossible to reach. Offshore wind is delayed. Solar deployment is slowed by grid constraints. The Champlain-Hudson line was supposed to deliver firm, around-the-clock electricity.
Now it's a liability because Trump gave Quebec the ability to threaten it. But wait, there's something even worse. The immediate crisis was diffused. Trump paused many Canadian tariffs temporarily. Quebec hasn't followed through on threats to break contracts. The Clean Energy Connect is operational and delivering power as contracted. The Champlain-Hudson line is still on schedule for May, but the damage is done. The trust that allowed 40 years of electricity cooperation is fundamentally shaken. Premier Legault said it explicitly. Quebec can never trust the United States the same way again. That's not rhetoric. That's strategic recalculation. Future energy projects will happen with Quebec keeping options open. Maybe smaller contracts, maybe more flexibility to redirect power to Ontario, maybe less willingness to invest in infrastructure that only benefits American markets. And here's what that means in practice. Massachusetts and New York are stuck. They've already spent billions on transmission lines that only work if Quebec sends electricity. They can't rebuild their energy strategies around different suppliers. Canadian hydropower is the only clean baseload option within realistic transmission distance. The result is exactly the opposite of what Trump intended. He wanted to extract money from Canada through tariffs. Instead, he handed Quebec enormous leverage over American states, undermined energy security for millions of people, threatened climate goals with broad public support, and demonstrated to the world that American trade policy is chaotic and unreliable. Every megawatt of Canadian electricity flowing into New England is now a reminder that Trump created vulnerability where none existed. Quebec always had the option to threaten supply. They just never needed to use it because the relationship worked. Both sides benefited. The cooperation made sense. Trump ended that comfortable assumption, and Legault made absolutely certain everyone understood Quebec has options. Options that would leave New England scrambling for power, paying higher prices, burning more fossil fuels, and explaining to voters why electricity bills jumped because of a trade war they opposed. Now, I want to show you something that really concerns me: the precedent. This isn't just about electricity, it's about what happens when you make infrastructure a weapon. Massachusetts and New York built transmission lines assuming Canada would remain a reliable partner. That assumption is gone. Other states watching this are reconsidering cross-border projects. Why invest billions in infrastructure if the president can start a trade war that makes it worthless? The chilling effect on future projects will be real. And it's not just electricity. This applies to pipelines, water agreements, transportation corridors, anything that requires long-term cooperation and massive capital investment. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Think about what this means for American energy independence. That's supposed to be Trump's whole thing: energy dominance, America first. Except what he actually did was prove to northeastern states that they can't rely on American political stability. They built critical infrastructure based on partnership, and Trump turned partnership into hostage situations. So what are Massachusetts and New York supposed to do now? Double down on Canadian imports, knowing Quebec has leverage, or try to build domestic alternatives that will take decades and cost more than the transmission lines they already built? Either option is bad. Either option is expensive. Either option proves Trump created a problem that didn't exist. And this is the part that kept me up last night: the political calculation for Quebec. Hydro-Quebec isn't just a utility company. It's a crown corporation owned by the provincial government. Every dollar of profit goes to Quebec's treasury. In 2022, Hydro-Quebec paid a $3.4 billion dividend to the provincial government. That's real money funding provincial programs, infrastructure, and services. American electricity exports are part of that revenue, but they're not irreplaceable. Quebec has options. They can sell to Ontario. They can invest in battery storage and sell power when prices are higher. They can build out infrastructure to other Canadian provinces. They can electrify Quebec's economy further and use the power domestically. What Quebec can't do anymore is trust that American contracts are reliable. Trump proved that. Even with signed agreements, even with billions in sunk infrastructure costs, even with 40 years of successful cooperation, American political leadership can threaten it all on a whim. So Quebec will hedge. And hedging means less commitment to American markets, which means exactly the vulnerability Trump was supposedly trying to avoid. Now, here's what nobody's talking about in the media: the economic ripple effects.
Massachusetts ratepayers were promised $50 million in annual savings from the Clean Energy Connect. Those savings depend on Quebec actually wanting to sell power at contracted rates. If Quebec decides to be difficult, if they meet minimum contractual obligations but nothing more, those savings evaporate, rates go up, and voters get angry.
New York faces the same problem. The Champlain-Hudson Line was supposed to save ratepayers $17 billion over 30 years. That calculation assumes friendly relations, assumes Quebec wants to maximize exports, assumes cooperation continues. Trump's tariffs put all those assumptions in question. And when voters see their electricity bills, they won't blame Quebec. They'll blame whoever's in charge when the bills arrive. The political consequences extend beyond energy too. This was supposed to be a climate victory for northeastern states. They were reducing fossil fuel dependency, meeting emissions targets, showing the rest of the country that the clean energy transition is possible and affordable. Now that narrative is compromised. Climate goals depend on Quebec's goodwill. Emissions reductions depend on foreign electricity that can be threatened. The entire clean energy strategy is vulnerable to trade war politics. What does that do to public support for climate action? When voters see that going green means depending on Canada, and depending on Canada means vulnerability to Trump's trade wars, support weakens. The political coalition supporting climate action fractures. Progress stalls. Trump didn't just threaten electricity supply, he threatened the political viability of climate policy in states that were actually making progress. And the precedent extends globally, too. Other countries are watching this. Canada isn't some adversary. It's America's closest ally, the longest undefended border in the world, deeply integrated economies. If the US will start trade wars with Canada over nothing, weaponizing critical infrastructure, what does that tell other countries about American reliability? It tells them to hedge, to diversify, to assume American commitments aren't worth the paper they're written on, and to build infrastructure that doesn't depend on US cooperation, because that cooperation can evaporate overnight. Trump's approach to trade doesn't account for infrastructure timelines. You can't turn power plants on and off based on tweet diplomacy. These are 20-year contracts, decade-long construction projects, billions in capital that can't be redeployed if political winds shift. And what really keeps me up is this. The lights are still on, for now. Hydro-Quebec is still delivering power. The contracts are holding, but everyone in New England now knows they could go dark, and Quebec knows it has leverage it didn't fully appreciate before. Future negotiations will happen in that shadow. Water rights, environmental policy, trade disputes, anything crossing the border. This is what happens when you elect someone who doesn't understand policy, who doesn't consult experts, who thinks every relationship is transactional and every negotiation is about dominance. Trump saw tariffs and thought leverage. He didn't see the transmission lines, the 40-year relationship, the billions in infrastructure investment, the asymmetric dependency. He didn't understand that electricity is different from oil. You can't replace it quickly. You can't build alternatives in months or even years. And now millions of Americans in blue states are vulnerable because their president couldn't be bothered to think 3 moves ahead. The New England Clean Energy Connect is operational. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express is finishing construction. Billions spent, infrastructure in place, 20-year contracts signed, all designed to make northeastern states more dependent on Quebec hydro. Trump made Quebec weaponize what was supposed to be partnership, and the consequences will echo for decades. What really gets me is the scale of the incompetence. This wasn't necessary. The relationship worked. Both sides benefited. 40 years of cooperation, and Trump blew it up because he didn't understand how electricity grids operate. Look, I've been covering politics for a while. I've seen bad decisions. I've seen unforced errors. But this is different. This is creating vulnerability where none existed. This is giving leverage to the other side. This is weakening American states to own the libs or whatever the calculation was. And the worst part? It won't be Trump who pays the price. It'll be Massachusetts residents when their electricity bills go up. It'll be New York businesses when grid reliability becomes questionable.
It'll be Vermont families when their 25% Canadian power supply becomes a political football. Trump will be gone. The consequences will remain.